Oh, well, hello there, and welcome to Frank Reads. I'm Frank Hasenmuller, and I've been reading some of my favorite stories lately, and I thought I'd share them with you. I enjoy them, and I hope you will too. Today we're going back to the world of fairy tales for an original version of a story that we're all familiar with, but I wanted to read the earliest version because, while it is familiar, it also differs quite a bit from the version that we usually think of when we think of this story. It was written by Charles Perrault in the year 1607, and Charles Perrault, you will remember, wrote Bluebeard, which I read a couple of videos ago. So now let's read the earliest version of Little Red Riding Hood. Once upon a time, there was a little village girl, the prettiest that had ever been seen. Her mother doted on her, and her grandmother even more. This good woman made her a little red hood, which suited her so well that she was called Little Red Riding Hood wherever she went. One day, after her mother had baked some biscuits, she said to Little Red Riding Hood, "Go and see how your grandmother's feeling. I've heard that she's sick. You can take her some biscuits and this small pot of butter." Little Red Riding Hood departed at once to visit her grandmother, who lived in another village. In passing through the forest, she met old neighbor Wolf, who had a great desire to eat her. But he did not dare, because of some woodcutters who were in the forest. He asked her where she was going, and the poor child, who did not know that it is dangerous to stop and listen to a wolf, said to him, "I'm going to see my grandmother, and I'm bringing her some biscuits with a small pot of butter that my mother's sending her." "Does she live far from here?" the wolf asked. "Oh, yes," Little Red Riding Hood said. "You've got to go by the mill, which you can see right over there, and hers is the first house in the village." "Well then," said the wolf, "I'll go and see her too. You take that path there, and I'll take this path here, and we'll see who'll get there first." The wolf began to run as fast as he could on the path that was shorter, and the little girl took the longer path, and she enjoyed herself by gathering nuts, running after butterflies, and making bouquets of small flowers that she found along the way. It did not take the wolf long to arrive at the grandmother's house, and he knocked. "Who's there?" "It's your granddaughter, Little Red Riding Hood," the wolf said, disguising his voice. "I brought you some biscuits and a little pot of butter that my mother sent for you." The good grandmother, who was in her bed because she was not feeling well, cried out to him, "Pull the bobbin, and the latch will fall." The wolf pulled the bobbin, and the door opened. He pounced on the good woman and devoured her quicker than a wink, for it had been more than 3 days since he had eaten last. After that, he closed the door and lay down in the grandmother's bed to wait for Little Red Riding Hood, who, after a while, came knocking at the door. "Who's there?" When she heard the gruff voice of the wolf, Little Red Riding Hood was scared at first, but she thought her grandmother had a cold and responded, "It's your granddaughter, Little Red Riding Hood. I've brought you some biscuits and a little pot of butter that my mother sent for you." The wolf softened his voice and cried out to her, "Pull the bobbin, and the latch will fall." Little Red Riding Hood pulled the bobbin, and the door opened. Upon seeing her enter, the wolf hid himself under the bed covers and said to her, "Put the biscuits and a pot of butter on the bin, and come lie down, next to me." Little Red Riding Hood undressed and went to get into bed, where she was quite astonished to see the way her grandmother was dressed in her nightgown. And she said to her, "What big arms you have, grandmother." "The better to hug you with, my child." "What big legs you have, grandmother." "The better to run with, my child." "What big ears you have, grandmother." "The better to hear you with, my child." "What big eyes you have, grandmother." "The better to see you with, my child." "What big teeth you have, grandmother." "The better to eat you with." And upon saying these words, the wicked wolf pounced on Little Red Riding Hood and ate her up. Moral: one sees here that young children, especially pretty girls, polite, well-taught, and pure as pearls, should stay on guard against all sorts of men. For if one fails to stay alert, it won't be strange to see one eaten by a wolf enraged. I say a wolf, since not all types are wild, or can be said to be the same in kind. Some are winning and have sharp minds. Some are loud or smooth or mild. Others appear just kind and unriled. They follow young ladies wherever they go, right into the halls of their very own homes. Alas, for those who've refused the truth, sweetest tongue has the sharpest tooth. There you go. There's the earliest version of Little Red Riding Hood that we have. And you'll notice it is pretty different from the default version we think of, just in the fact that usually when we think of the story, we imagine it ending with a woodsman showing up to rescue Little Red Riding Hood and her grandmother. But that didn't happen this time. It literally ends with the grandmother and Red Riding Hood being eaten. And that's the end. Because, as the poem explained, the moral is that girls need to stand guard against predatory men, because sometimes there won't be anybody to rescue them. Of course, the moral is kind of strange because it kind of puts it on girls to stand guard against men and not on men to not be predators. But there you go. It was the early 17th century. But it's a good example of how fairy tales were really designed to teach children in the audience. But some of the earliest ones are also pretty violent and horrific because they weren't meant solely for children. They were meant to be enjoyed by everyone of all ages. And that was a good example. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you will join me next time. And until then, keep reading.